Sweet. So let's go ahead and start off with just introducing yourself and your organization.
Hi there, I'm Becca Curry. I am the Colorado Policy Advocate with Earth Justice. We are an environmental law organization that works nationwide. We believe that the earth needs a good lawyer.
Thank you. And then specifically today, first off, I want to introduce myself just because I know a lot of people won't know me, but I'm the legislative intern for Western Colorado Alliance. Everybody who's getting this should know who we are, but if not, we just focus on making sure that the West Slope also has that grassroots organizing voice that a lot of other areas do. And then today specifically, we're going to be talking about the Colorado legislature, specifically House Bill 21-1266. So do you want to talk a little bit about why your organization is in favor of it?
Absolutely. Yeah, this bill is really meant to kind of think ahead what the path forward for environmental justice is here in Colorado. It's well beyond time that we, collectively acknowledge as a state that we've hurt communities for years and years through racist and unjust environmental policies and practices. We know that facilities emit toxic pollution into the air and harmful contaminants into our waters. And we also know that lower income communities and communities of color have historically been forced to bear the burden of unsustainably high pollution levels. And, that's only been reinforced during this pandemic. We know even more now how inextricably connected pollution is with public health. And it's also, while the state has made some progress towards advancing environmental justice, these efforts have fallen short. They've really focused on communicating, getting information out to communities, but engagement is improving, but we're stopping short of actually doing something about the problem and making sure that we are mitigating harm and avoiding harm. And this bill is hoping to be a clear step forward in the right direction of starting to make sure that we can get to those meaningful end goals of actually making a difference in changing how we address kind of environmental policy and regulation here in Colorado statewide.
Thank you, definitely. And following up on that, a lot of times being based in the Western Slope, we feel as though a lot of the legislation is focused more on the Front Range and doesn't trickle down to us as much. So how would you say this bill in particular kind of manages that? How will it affect the Western Slope? Will it affect the Western Slope? And, if
Absolutely.
so, how much?
Yeah, so, this really is meant to be, as I mentioned, a statewide bill. I know the Western Slope, and of course, this is regionally true of many different areas of Colorado. I feel like the Western Slope often gets highlighted a little bit, maybe more for oil and gas production. And, the area North Denver gets kind of highway and facility pollution, and down in Pueblo, it's a different set. There's in Colorado Springs, there's a lot of water issues with PFAS contamination. So we have these kind of silos of different issues in different places across the state. But we know that communities aren't just experiencing one issue. It's very true and pretty much true of every place in Colorado that there are water issues, there are air quality issues, there are issues with oil and gas production that are impacting communities simultaneously. And it's time that we start addressing these issues kind of in a cross-issue, cross-agency way, and also siloed in the way that these are, if it's oil and gas, it's the COGCC, if it's air, it's the AQCC, if it's water, it's the Water Quality Control Commission. So also siloed on the agency side. And so, yeah, this bill is really meant to reach all areas of Colorado and recognizing that it's time that we develop a kind of issue-wide, agency-wide, statewide plan for how we're going to move forward with environmental justice here in Colorado. And, this isn't the end-all be-all for environmental justice. It's really a bill that says we need to sit down and we need to have the conversation. It's a bill to essentially force the conversation that we start talking about environmental justice and start thinking about how we can holistically think about the ways that our environmental policies and regulations have impacted communities and made concrete strides towards addressing and mitigating and avoiding future harm across the state. Yeah.
Definitely. And I think that leads well into my next question. You talked a little bit about how it's not necessarily completing that, it's just starting that conversation. So within that, what do you feel there will be, like, what future steps are going to be necessary to complete the conversation that this is starting?
Absolutely. So, I mean, this bill has a bit of short-term goals and it has long-term goals. So in the short term, this bill does focus a little bit more on work that's going on at the AQCC and implementing the greenhouse gas reduction roadmap. That is essentially the state's plan to meet the climate targets that were laid out a few years back in House Bill 2019-1261 that essentially required that by certain years, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by certain percentages. And that bill, in requiring those greenhouse gas reductions, is going to require reductions happen across many different sectors. And, as I've mentioned before, like kind of the efforts to build equity into this process have fallen a bit short. I mean, it was paired with a climate equity framework, which kind of flagged different impacts in different communities and gave communities a climate, equity score, but it lacked operationalization. So it didn't really ever say which communities then what score merits a heightened level of engagement or outreach or communication. And so this bill is really doing a couple things in the short term to build some equity into that process, which again is kind of a statewide process of kind of implementing our greenhouse gas reduction targets. It will, for the first time, put a disproportionately impacted community definition into statute. And this is really following the lead of a number of other states that have tried to take the guesswork out of identifying these communities in both having some quantitative factors that are census-based factors. They're based on with readily available data that it should be a no-brainer for the agency to kind of identify these communities. That is essentially based on where more higher percentages of people of color reside, or low-income communities, where we would be kind of creating a set of communities that where outreach should be no-brainer. And then there's also these qualitative factors where a community could also be considered included in this disproportionately impacted community definition. For example, if they have a history of redlining or environmental racism in the area, or if they're experience multiple environmental burdens, there's kind of this qualitative set of factors that can bring a community into this definition as well. And so with this better guidance on what these communities are, the Air Quality Control Commission will be able to, and will actually be required by the bill to follow a set of like outreach or engagement best practices, which is including things like meetings at varied times, ensuring remote access, ensuring translation services. These are things that are kind of common sense, but have not yet been boiled down to law. So this is codifying them so they're enforceable, and we can ensure more robust engagement to a broader set of communities. But like I said, this is again, all efforts that are focusing on increasing communication, and we're not getting to the end goals of harm reduction and restorative justice. And without those clear goals in sight, we risk engaging communities in decisions that ultimately may perpetuate harm. So this bill also will set up a task force. And I know task forces, it's the devil's in the details of these task forces, right? But this is again, a task force that's essentially like, we are requiring that this group of people sit down and kind of create a plan, a blueprint for how we're going to move forward in Colorado to address a broader set of issues across agencies and across the state. And that task force has really strong community representation. It has some representatives of different agencies to finally get them in the room together. It has tribal representation, and it does have some, business, labor, industry reps, but it should be a good group to sit down, and they are really have pretty clear things that they're supposed to discuss, like a potential requirement that we are able to deny a permit if there's no way that we can mitigate or avoid harm to communities. That's not unprecedented. New Jersey is one example of a state that has proceeded with such a requirement where we shouldn't be renewing permits if they are going to harm communities. And so there is a set of policy options for the task force to consider, and they're supposed to provide, recommendations towards the end of this next year, with the goal that their recommendations become implementing legislation in 2023, so that we can finally finally kind of put words into action and move forward with an environmental justice plan. So, you kind of mentioned like, what are other steps necessary to accomplish these goals? And this is an opportunity. The task force is meant to have public meetings. This is supposed to be a robust process that's accessible to the public. And they need to hold kind of meetings that are remote and available across regions throughout the state. And this is really going to be an opportunity for communities and advocates to hold the task force's feet to the fire and push for really strong recommendations with greater buy-in, so that we can hold the state to really strong environmental justice progress and protections moving forward into the future.
Definitely, thank you. And I feel like that kind of answers any other question that I had. It's really good look into the bill, not only what it's aiming to do right now in the short term, as you said, but kind of the long term. Where do we go from here? And once again, your organization is supporting it. WCA, we're supporting it. So with that, thank you for your time, for educating us on this bill and kind of giving your perspective on it, as well as I just wanted to mention that the bill will be up in the Appropriations Committee May 11th. And if anybody watching this wants to help out, they can do written testimony or they can do video testimony. If you have questions about how to do that, we'll have that within a larger email. But once again, I just really wanted to thank you for your time. I appreciate you responding so quickly and being so flexible. And thank you for educating us on this bill.
Absolutely. Look forward to working with all of you to advance environmental justice here in Colorado. Thank you.
Definitely.